1 year ago, Evangeline Kingsley fired Bennett Cole in the middle of an aviation plant, calling him a useless single father who had wrecked the company's future. The whole board laughed as he walked out with his employee badge sliced in two, and the chief financial officer told him he should go back to fixing rented cars. Bennett did not argue. He simply carried out the blueprint no one had bothered to read. 1 year later, Forbes announced the richest man in American aviation, Bennett Cole, and on that very day, Kingsley Aero needed him to save a fleet worth billions. If you love a reversal that leaves the arrogant speechless, subscribe now and stay with this incredibly satisfying story. The rain came down hard over Seattle the morning Bennett Cole was called to the glass conference room high above the Kingsley Aerodynamics factory floor. Below him, the assembly line moved in its usual rhythm, machines humming and workers bent over half-finished flight control systems that would one day carry passengers across oceans. Bennett stepped off the freight elevator still wearing his old engineer's coat, his hands faintly streaked with oil from the auxiliary wing controller he had been inspecting less than an hour earlier. He was a quiet man, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what he could do with a diagnostic panel and a set of test logs. In his arms he carried a thick bound report, one that warned of a lethal flaw hidden inside the KX-47 flight stabilizer, the very device Kingsley was about to sell to several major airlines. He had asked for this meeting 3 times. He had no idea it would be the last one he ever attended as an employee. Evangeline Kingsley stood at the head of the long table, framed by the gray sky behind her, flanked by the board, the legal team, and a handful of investors who had flown in for the quarter. She was young for a chief executive, sharp-featured and immaculate, carrying the weight of a family name that had built engines since before she was born. She did not look at the report in Bennett's hands. She had already been briefed, and she believed every word of that briefing because it had come from a man she trusted more than she trusted her own instincts. Sterling Wainwright, the chief financial officer, sat to her right with the calm smile of someone who had rehearsed the outcome in advance. To him, this was not a difficult decision. It was housekeeping. "Mr. Cole," Evangeline began, her voice measured and cold, "we have reviewed the delays on the KX-47 line. We know who caused them." Bennett opened his mouth to answer, but Sterling cut across him smoothly. "A mechanic who thinks he is a genius," Sterling said, letting the words land in the room like a verdict. "He slowed the entire line, cost us a contract worth tens of millions, and now he wants to lecture us on safety." A few directors chuckled. Bennett felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his face still, because he had learned long ago that panic never fixed anything, not in an engine and not in a room full of people who had already decided. Evangeline straightened, and when she spoke again, her words were aimed with precision. "Kingsley Aero cannot keep paying a useless single father who only knows how to create problems." The sentence struck exactly where she intended, straight into the one thing Bennett could not armor over, his pride as a man who had built his life around being useful. The laughter grew a little louder. Sterling reached across the table, took Bennett's employee badge, and cut it cleanly in two with a pair of shears, laying both halves on the polished surface like a trophy of humiliation. Bennett did not shout. He did not beg. He looked at Evangeline with a steadiness that unsettled her more than any outburst could have, and he said, "One day you will wish you had read the last page." Evangeline did not blink. "That day will never come," she answered. He gathered the report, turned, and walked out. In the corridor beyond the glass, the noise of the factory swallowed him whole. His phone buzzed, and a small voice on the other end asked whether he would be home for dinner. It was his daughter, Nora, and the sharp edges inside him softened at once. He told her he would be there, and he meant it. Then he stood for a moment at the tall windows overlooking the plant, watching the KX-47 systems roll down the line like a promise he could not stop, and he understood that the danger buried in that machine did not care who was fired. On his way out, he glanced up once at the Kingsley Aero logo mounted above the entrance, the emblem he had served for years, and then he walked into the rain with the blueprint pressed to his chest. To understand what had truly happened in that glass room, one had to go back several weeks, to the days before the badge was ever cut. Bennett had come to aviation the long way, without the polish of a family fortune or a prestigious degree handed to him at graduation. He had started as a mechanic on the tarmac, then flown as a backup test pilot on short verification runs, then spent years in maintenance bays learning the difference between an engine that sounded fine and one that was quietly dying. That experience made him the kind of safety inspector who could not be fooled by clean paperwork because he had felt too many machines lie to too many people who trusted them. When Kingsley assigned him to certify the KX-47 flight stabilizer, he treated it the way he treated everything, as a system that would eventually be trusted with human lives. Deep inside the balancing algorithm, in the exact conditions that engineers rarely tested and pilots dreaded, Bennett found the flaw. When an aircraft met a strong crosswind at low altitude, the system could misread its own correction and adjust the wrong way, gently at first and then all at once. It would not drop a plane out of the sky on a calm day. But in an emergency, in the narrow seconds when everything mattered, the machine could turn a survivable moment into a fatal one. In most industries, a small error was an inconvenience. In aviation, a single miscalculation could erase a company's name forever, along with the people it was meant to protect. Bennett reported the flaw the proper way, up the chain, to Sterling Wainwright. But Sterling did not want a flaw. He wanted a signature. The KX-47 had to pass certification quickly because a deal with Blackthorn Capital depended on it, and that deal carried a bonus large enough to change a man's life. If the product was delayed, Sterling lost the money and lost his window to sell his stake in Kingsley Aero at the peak of its value. So he made a choice that no honest man makes. He altered test data, erased several warnings buried in the system logs, and quietly built a story in which Bennett was not a whistleblower, but a saboteur, an unstable engineer tampering with software he did not fully understand. Evangeline had inherited the chief executive's chair only recently, and she carried the constant pressure of proving she deserved the Kingsley name rather than merely wearing it. She wanted stability, momentum, and loyalty, and Sterling offered her all three wrapped in confident language. When Bennett tried to reach her privately, he was turned away at the door. When he finally forced a few minutes of her time, she listened for only as long as it took to decide he was fighting the company rather than trying to save it. She did not see a warning, she saw an obstacle, and so the truth was buried beneath a layer of trust placed in exactly the wrong hands. There had been a night, 3 weeks before the badge was cut, when Bennett stayed long past the end of his shift, running the crosswind scenario again and again on a simulation rig in the corner of the certification lab. Each time the numbers returned, they told him the same thing, and each time he hoped he had made an error somewhere in his own setup. But the flaw was real, and it was patient, waiting inside the algorithm for the exact combination of altitude and wind that would one day arrive on a real flight with real passengers aboard. He had sat there alone under the humming fluorescent lights and felt the particular loneliness of a man who knows a dangerous truth that no one around him wants to believe. It was not a feeling of superiority. It was closer to dread. On his final night in the maintenance wing, before anyone had spoken the word fired, Bennett quietly backed up the original blueprint and the real, unaltered test data, copying it to a secure drive of his own. He did it out of habit, the same instinct that made him double-check a bolt he had already tightened. He also copied the raw simulation outputs, the ones with their timestamps intact, and the internal messages he had exchanged with Sterling requesting a formal review. He did not yet know that this quiet act would one day become the single most valuable thing he owned. A set of files capable of rescuing not only one company, but an entire corner of the aviation world. He simply knew that the truth deserved a witness, even if no one wanted to hear it yet. In an industry where a single lie could cost hundreds of lives, he had decided long ago that he would rather lose his job than lose his conscience. After he walked out of Kingsley Aero, Bennett Cole vanished from the industry. To Evangeline and the board, he was nothing more than a bitter former employee who had disappeared into obscurity, exactly where such people belonged. Sterling helped the story along, whispering to contacts that Bennett had been rejected by several firms because of a risky profile, a man too unstable to hire. The narrative was tidy and convenient, and because no one had reason to question it, it hardened into accepted fact. For a while, the man who had warned them about the KX-47 might as well have never existed at all. The truth was far larger than anyone in that glass room could have imagined. Bennett held several patents of his own, quiet work he had done on flight balancing systems in the margins of his career, and he owned copies of the genuine certification data that Kingsley had tried to erase. With those two things, plus a small venture loan and a rented hangar on the edge of an unglamorous airfield, he founded a company he called Cole Meridian Aviation. In the beginning, it was almost nothing. 3 former colleagues who believed in him, a handful of tools, and a stubborn refusal to build anything he could not certify with his own name. Bennett did not chase the glittering parts of the industry. He did not want shiny jets or magazine covers. Instead, he bought the pieces everyone else overlooked: the maintenance shops slipping toward bankruptcy, the parts warehouses undervalued because their owners did not understand what they held, the ground service routes the large corporations had abandoned as unprofitable. He understood something the powerful families of aviation had forgotten. Control of the sky did not belong to whoever owned the aircraft. It belonged to whoever owned the maintenance, the rare components, the safety software, and the right to fix an emergency when everything went wrong at 40,000 feet. His attorney, Maris Whitaker, was as sharp as any weapon Bennett had ever handled. She combed through the industry's forgotten corners and discovered a startling truth. Several crucial patents tied to flight balancing had been neglected by the very corporations that should have guarded them, allowed to drift into obscurity because no one recognized their worth. Bennett bought them, one at a time, at prices that seemed absurdly low, precisely because the market had not yet realized how much it would soon need them. Every acquisition was quiet, legal, and patient. He was not building an empire for show. He was building leverage that could not be argued away. The early months were not glamorous. Bennett spent his mornings in the rented hangar with a wrench in his hand, and his evenings poring over contracts Maris flagged for him, learning the legal architecture of an industry the way he had once learned the mechanical one, part by part, until the whole thing made sense. He slept little, ate at odd hours, and kept a photograph of Nora taped to the corner of his monitor so that, when the doubt came, as it did on the hardest nights, he had something solid to look at. He hired people no one else wanted, the older mechanics dismissed as too slow for modern lines, the inspectors who had been let go for raising too many questions, the engineers whose warnings had made them inconvenient. They came to him because he did not treat their caution as a defect. He treated it as the point. Within a single year, Cole Meridian Aviation became the silent structure standing behind hundreds of safe flights. It repaired software flaws other firms could not diagnose, supplied rare components no one else could source, propped up small carriers that would otherwise have collapsed, and rescued freight contracts on the edge of failure. When a regional airline discovered a fault in its aging fleet, with no one willing to certify a fix in time, it was Cole Meridian that answered the call and kept the planes in the air without cutting a single corner. Word spread through the working corners of the industry, not the boardrooms but the maintenance bays and the dispatch offices. That there was finally a company that would tell you the truth about your aircraft even when the truth was expensive. Bennett never boasted about any of it. He worked, he raised his daughter, he built his team, and he waited for the day the truth would finally speak on its own. And then, near the end of that year, a Forbes investigation began circling a question that no one in the industry could answer. Who was the mysterious man quietly buying up the backbone of American aviation? 1 year to the day after Bennett was fired, Evangeline Kingsley walked into the same conference room to prepare for a contract meant to save her company. Kingsley Aero was in trouble. The KX-47 had drawn suspicion from customer after customer, and a few airlines had begun to delay their orders, citing questions they could not get answered. Blackthorn Capital was circling, pressing to buy a controlling stake at a price that grew more favorable to them with every crisis. Evangeline told herself she was in command, that she was making the deal from strength. She had convinced herself of many things that year. Then the news screen on the conference room wall shifted, and a headline scrolled across it that turned the room to stone. Bennett Cole named the richest man in aviation. For a long moment, no one spoke. The photograph on the screen showed the man they had once called useless, now dressed in a dark, well-cut suit, standing in front of a fleet of jets bearing the Cole Meridian insignia. Forbes estimated his fortune far above many of the traditional billionaires of the field, built on a network of maintenance operations, patents, safety software, and stakes in companies most people had never heard of. He looked calm, certain, and entirely unbothered by the world that had thrown him away. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face. Sterling forced a laugh and said it was surely a coincidence, some other man who happened to share the name, but the images and the records left no room for doubt. It was Bennett Cole, former engineer at Kingsley Aero, founder of Cole Meridian Aviation. The directors around the table began, slowly, to turn their eyes toward Evangeline. One of them leaned in and asked quietly, "Is that the Bennett we let go?" No one answered. The silence itself was the answer, and it was louder than anything anyone could have said. The first great reversal had arrived. The man they had branded as worthless had not merely survived. He had become the richest figure in the very industry Kingsley believed he had no right to exist in. And before the room could even absorb that fact, an assistant burst through the door with an emergency that made everything worse. The Aviation Safety Authority was demanding that Kingsley Aero explain the KX-47. If the company could not produce a credible solution within 48 hours, every contract tied to the stabilizer would be frozen. The machine Bennett had warned them about was no longer a rumor. It was a countdown. The crisis broke open with brutal speed. One airline after another demanded proof that the KX-47 was safe to fly, and the demands arrived faster than any team could answer them. If Kingsley failed, it would lose its contracts, its stock would fall into free descent, and Blackthorn Capital would finally have the pretext to seize the company for almost nothing. Evangeline gathered her engineering team and asked for a fix. She got silence, then hedging, then fear. No one in the room had a complete answer. Finally, a young engineer, his voice shaking, said the only thing no one wanted to hear. The fastest way to correct the flaw was to use the original algorithm designed by the one person who had discovered it in the first place, Bennett Cole. Sterling objected at once, sharply, insistently. Bennett was the cause of the crisis, he argued, a man who could never be trusted near their systems again. But Evangeline had begun at last to doubt. If Bennett was truly useless, why had Forbes just named him the richest man in aviation? Why did his company hold so much of the technology Kingsley now desperately needed? The story she had accepted a year ago no longer fit the facts in front of her, and the gap between them had grown into a chasm she could no longer step over. Then a formal email arrived from Maris Whitaker, and its tone was as cold as a closed vault. Cole Meridian Aviation, it stated, currently held several patents related to flight balancing systems that the KX-47 was actively infringing. If Kingsley continued to sell the product without negotiating, Bennett Cole had every right to seek a commercial injunction that would halt it entirely. Evangeline read the message twice before its full meaning settled over her. Kingsley did not merely need Bennett to fix the flaw. Kingsley was building its future on technology that Bennett now legally controlled. The man they had humiliated held the company's survival in his hands. Sterling pushed hard, urging Evangeline to sign the sale to Conrad Blackthorne before the truth could surface, insisting it was the only way to keep her chair as chief executive. But for the first time, Evangeline saw the shape of the trap. If she sold now, in the middle of a manufactured crisis, the Kingsley family would lose the entire empire her ancestors had built. Sterling was not offering her a lifeline. He was offering her a shovel to dig her own grave, and calling it salvation. She realized she could no longer trust the man who had been her closest counsel, and so she was forced to do the one thing her pride had sworn she would never do. She picked up the phone to call Bennett Cole. He did not answer. Instead, Maris Whitaker responded on his behalf, and her words were precise and unhurried. "If Kingsley Aero wishes to meet with Mr. Cole," she said, "please submit a formal request, the same as any other company would." The reversal cut deep and clean. The chief executive, who had thrown Bennett out of a conference room, now had to request an appointment with him, like a junior partner hoping to be granted an audience. 2 days later, Evangeline, Sterling, and several Kingsley directors arrived at the headquarters of Cole Meridian Aviation. The place did not carry the heavy grandeur of old family money. It was modern, precise, and quietly powerful in a way that unsettled them the moment they stepped out of their cars. Beyond the entrance stretched a private runway, a row of maintenance hangars, a data coordination center glowing with screens, and a fleet of jets marked with the Cole Meridian insignia. Everything about the place said the same thing. Here, results mattered more than reputation. Evangeline watched hundreds of engineers moving through the facility in focused, professional silence. No one rushed to greet her. No one flinched at the Kingsley name. In her own factory, that name had opened every door and silenced every objection. Here, it meant nothing at all. The power in this building did not flow from a family crest or an inherited fortune. It flowed from genuine competence, from people who knew exactly what they were doing and did not need anyone's permission to be proud of it. It was a kind of authority Evangeline had never truly built, only inherited, and standing inside it made her feel the difference for the first time. Dawson Harlan, the head of security, met the Kingsley group at the entrance. Sterling, already irritated, announced that they had a scheduled meeting with the chairman, as though the fact might buy them some deference. Dawson checked his tablet without hurry and answered, "Mr. Cole is expecting you. Please follow me." The word chairman, spoken about Bennett with that plain respect, made Evangeline pause almost imperceptibly. 1 year ago, people had said Bennett's name with contempt as a punchline. Now everyone inside this building spoke it with absolute regard, and the shift landed on her like a slow, cold weight. As they crossed one of the hangars, Sterling caught sight of an experimental aircraft being fitted with a new balancing system, technicians moving around it with careful, practiced hands. A passing engineer mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the technology had already saved 3 carriers from having to ground their entire fleets. Evangeline understood then what she had refused to understand a year ago. Bennett had not built his fortune through financial tricks or clever leverage alone. He had built it on the one thing Kingsley had always treated as an obstacle: technical safety, done right, without shortcuts. The very quality they had punished him for defending was now the foundation of an empire. At the end of the corridor, a door slid open. Bennett stepped through it, calm and unhurried, wearing a simple shirt rather than a suit meant to broadcast power. He did not need to perform authority. He carried it the way a good engineer carries certainty, quietly and completely. Dawson turned to the group and said, "Mr. Cole, Chairman, the Kingsley delegation has arrived." Evangeline heard those words and, unbidden, remembered the day she had called this same man useless in front of a laughing board. The memory tasted like ash. The meeting began with Evangeline trying to hold the posture of a chief executive. She suggested that both sides set aside old misunderstandings and focus on what was best for the future of aviation, as though the past could be folded up and put away. Bennett did not raise his voice. He simply asked her to call the thing that had happened by its true name. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a wrongful termination, a baseless accusation, and a deliberate act meant to silence the one person who had discovered a safety flaw. He would not build anything new on a lie about the past. Sterling interrupted, telling Bennett he ought to be grateful that Kingsley had ever given him a chance at all. Bennett reached into his coat and set something on the table with quiet finality. The employee badge, still cut cleanly in two, the same halves Sterling had left on a polished surface a year before. "I kept it," Bennett said, "to remember that sometimes the part cut out of a company is the only part still keeping it alive." The words settled over the room like frost. No one laughed this time. Maris Whitaker laid out the ownership documents with methodical precision. Cole Meridian Aviation held the critical patents, maintenance contracts with many of Kingsley's own former customers, and a portion of the very debt Kingsley Aero had pledged against its future. If Bennett chose to act, he could block the KX-47 from the market within weeks. A few weeks was all it would take for Kingsley to collapse entirely. Evangeline's face went pale, but she held her silence. She understood, finally, that she was no longer in the position to grant anything. She was sitting across the table from the man who could decide whether her company lived or died. For a moment, Evangeline searched Bennett's face for the thing she expected to find there: the gloating, the hunger to watch her suffer, the small, cruel satisfaction of a man finally holding the whip. She found none of it. What she found instead was harder to bear, because it was simply patience, the patience of someone who had been right all along and had known he would be, and had chosen to wait rather than to shout. It occurred to her, sitting in that quiet room, that she had never once considered what it had cost Bennett to keep his silence for a year while she rose and stumbled and rose again on the strength of a lie told about him. Bennett did not name a price for revenge. Instead, he laid out 3 preliminary requirements, plain and non-negotiable. First, Kingsley would reopen the record of his dismissal. Second, all of the KX-47 test data would be submitted to an independent audit. Third, Sterling Wainwright would be immediately suspended from any access to the technical files. Sterling exploded, calling it extortion, a shakedown dressed up as principal. He turned to the other directors and demanded to know whether they were really going to let a disgruntled former mechanic dictate terms to a company with a century of history behind it. But the directors did not meet his eyes, because they had all just watched the news screen, and the century of history he invoked was worth nothing against a headline and a set of patents. Bennett only looked at Evangeline and said, "If you still trust him more than you trust the data, this meeting is over." For the first time in her career, Evangeline was forced to choose between her pride and the truth. Bennett asked that the report he had submitted before his firing be displayed on the screen. Evangeline recognized it instantly. It was the bound document she had refused to read, the one she had waved aside as the ranting of a bitter man. Bennett turned it to the last page, the very page he had spoken of on the day they threw him out. It did not contain only a technical warning. It contained an access log, a plain record showing that the test data had been altered after Bennett submitted his report, and the accounts with permission to make those changes at that time belonged to Sterling Wainwright, and a secondary login connected to Blackthorn Capital. The room fell into a heavy, airless silence. Sterling insisted the data had been forged, his voice climbing toward panic. But Maris produced the backups from an independent server, complete with timestamps and internal emails that could not be waved away. In one of those emails, Sterling had written that if the KX-47 were delayed, Bennett Cole should be treated as an obstacle to be removed. Evangeline read that line and felt the last of her cold composure fall away. She remembered Bennett's eyes on the day of his firing. He had not been angry about losing his job. He had been in pain because no one would look at the truth, and now she understood exactly why. Bennett explained the flaw itself clearly, without hiding behind difficult jargon. He said, plainly, that the system could react the wrong way when an aircraft met a strong crosswind at low altitude, precisely the moment when a correct response mattered most. It was a flaw that had to be fixed at once, not buried under altered paperwork and confident smiles. A Kingsley engineer who had come with the delegation studied the analysis and confirmed, quietly, that Bennett was right. The admission stripped Sterling of his last footing. Cornered, he turned and began to blame Evangeline instead, pointing out that she was the one who had signed the termination order. It was a naked betrayal, performed in the open, and it showed Evangeline that Sterling had never been loyal to her at all. Bennett let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "I did not come back to prove you wrong," he said, looking directly at Evangeline. "I came back because if you keep being wrong, real aircraft will pay the price." The words lifted him above the room. He was powerful without being petty, ruthless with the truth but unwilling to let anyone treat human safety as a bargaining chip. He had every reason to enjoy their downfall, and instead he kept his eyes on the machine, on the lives it would one day carry. It was the difference between a man seeking vengeance and a man seeking to be right about something that mattered. Just as Sterling was pushed fully into the corner, the large screen on the far wall lit up with an incoming video call. Conrad Blackthorne's face appeared, composed and courteous, the smile of a man who had never lost a negotiation he cared about. He spoke smoothly, saying that Blackthorne Capital stood ready to acquire Kingsley Aero, to keep Evangeline on as chief executive in name, and to handle all the legal difficulties quietly and cleanly. He made it sound like mercy. Bennett looked straight into the screen and asked the only question that mattered. Handle it how? By burying the KX-47 flaw, or by selling it into a market with fewer safety regulators watching? Conrad went silent for a single second, and that second told Bennett everything. Maris moved at once, presenting the evidence. Blackthorne Capital had already purchased Kingsley's debt in advance, then pressed Sterling to drive the company into crisis so it could be bought at a fraction of its worth. They had never intended to save Kingsley. They intended to strip it down and sell it off as liquidated parts. Evangeline realized, with a sickening clarity, that her family's empire was being peeled away one layer at a time. Sterling had not merely blamed Bennett to protect a bonus. He had led the wolves straight into the boardroom and held the door open for them. Conrad tried to shift the ground beneath him. He pointed out that Bennett, too, had bought debt and patents. So how was Cole Meridian any different from Blackthorne Capital? Bennett answered without heat. The difference, he said, lay entirely in purpose. Blackthorne bought to bury flaws and sell cheap. Cole Meridian bought to fix flaws and keep aircraft safe. It was the difference between predatory money and money that built something real, between capital that fed on ruin and capital that refused to let people die for the sake of a quarterly return. The two philosophies could not have stood in sharper contrast, and everyone in the room could see it now. Bennett turned back to Evangeline and laid the choice before her, without cruelty but without softness either. She could sign with Blackthorne and lose Kingsley Aero forever, watching the empire dissolve into someone else's balance sheet. Or she could bring the truth into the light, suspend Sterling, and accept Cole Meridian's help in rebuilding the entire safety system from the ground up. There was no third path that let her keep both her pride and her company. Evangeline stood, in that moment, before the largest decision she had ever faced as a chief executive, and she understood that whatever she chose, the version of herself who had cut a man's badge in half would not survive it. Evangeline asked for the meeting to pause so she could speak with Bennett alone, and they walked out into one of the hangars where the noise of the boardroom could not follow. The scene slowed and deepened. Around them stood the machinery of flight, the smell of fuel in the air, the blue glow of runway lights spilling through the great open doors. This was the world Bennett understood not from reports on a table, but from a lifetime of his own hands. And standing in it, Evangeline felt how far she had always been from the thing she claimed to lead. She asked him why he had not simply exposed everything the moment he was fired. Bennett answered plainly. At that time, he said, he was only a single father branded as useless. If he had spoken up without any power behind him, they would have called him a bitter man looking for revenge, and the truth would have died in the noise of that accusation. So he had chosen to build the power first, and let the truth speak afterward, when no one could dismiss it. He mentioned his daughter only briefly, his voice quiet. I did not want my little girl to grow up thinking her father had to beg the people who called him garbage. The detail carried real feeling without dragging a child into the heart of the conflict. Evangeline apologized. The words came out smaller than she intended, stripped of the authority she usually wore like armor, and for once she did not try to dress them up. But Bennett would not let the apology become an easy solution that let everyone move on unchanged. He told her she had not only wronged him, she had wronged the engineers, the mechanics, and the inspectors who had been pressured into silence to protect the Kingsley reputation. All the people who had learned that speaking the truth cost them their livelihoods. Every one of them had watched what happened to Bennett and drawn the obvious lesson, that in her company, honesty was a liability and silence was survival. That, he said, was the real damage. It was not one firing. It was a culture that had taught good people to keep their heads down while a dangerous machine rolled toward the sky. Evangeline began, at last, to understand the real lesson. Leadership was not standing on a height and deciding who had value and who did not. Leadership was knowing how to listen to the person below you when that person was telling you the truth, especially when the truth was inconvenient. She had confused authority with wisdom, the way people born into power so often do, and she had mistaken the loudest confidence in the room for the most reliable judgment. Bennett had never raised his voice, and so she had never heard him. Now, standing in a hangar that belonged to him, she finally did. She asked him what he wanted in order to save Kingsley. Bennett laid out his conditions clearly. His record would be publicly corrected. Sterling would be suspended and an independent investigation opened. Every KX-47 unit that failed to meet standard would be recalled. Cole Meridian would be granted technical oversight throughout the restructuring period, and Kingsley would never be permitted to use Bennett's name as a public relations trick to paper over its old failures. Evangeline agreed to all of it, though she knew the price was her own pride, laid down piece by piece in a hangar that smelled of fuel and truth. The Forbes story kept spreading, and the press gathered outside both headquarters, hungry for a sensational tale about a single father who had been fired and had risen to become the richest man in aviation. But Bennett refused to turn the story into a display of wealth. At a press conference, he said that the outside world saw only the fortune, while he saw the people the industry had overlooked, the engineers pressured into silence, the mechanics working through the night, the inspectors treated as obstacles for doing their jobs. He turned the spotlight away from himself and onto the ones who had carried the weight without ever being thanked. Evangeline stood behind him, for the first time not at the center of the stage. She listened as the man she had once scorned spoke about the things she had forgotten: safety, honor, and responsibility. Sterling was suspended. Investigators opened their files. Conrad Blackthorne withdrew his acquisition offer once his scheme to manipulate the debt was exposed, retreating rather than face the light. The Kingsley board was forced to vote in favor of a restructuring agreement with Coal Meridian, the very outcome they would have laughed at a year before. The largest reversal of all had settled quietly into place. Bennett was not merely richer than Kingsley. He had become the man who would decide whether Kingsley was still permitted to fly at all. Standing before the assembled workers of the plant, Evangeline said something no one expected to hear from her. 1 year ago, I called Bennett Coal useless. Today I admit that this company was the useless one, because it did not know how to listen to the man who tried to save it. The words fell over the entire factory floor, and the machines seemed to go quiet around them. For Bennett, it was not the final victory, but it was the restoration of the honor he had always deserved. A few weeks later, Bennett returned to the Kingsley Aero Factory, the place where he had once been driven out to the sound of laughter. This time he did not pass through the old employee gate. He walked in as the chairman of Coal Meridian Aviation and the controlling partner overseeing the safety restructuring, and the difference was written in the faces of everyone who watched him arrive. Dawson Harlan came with him, along with the security team. The workers on the floor looked at Bennett with plain respect. Some of them had stayed silent on the day he was fired, and now they lowered their heads in shame. Bennett did not hold it against them. He understood that anyone could be afraid of losing their job when power sat in the hands of the wrong people. Evangeline led him into the old conference room. On the table, faint but still visible, was the scratch where Sterling had once cut his badge in two. Bennett placed those same cut halves on the surface, laying them beside the new contract between Kingsley Aero and Coal Meridian. He did not ask Evangeline to kneel and beg. He did not destroy the Kingsley family or grind them into ruin. He did something that cut deeper into the arrogant than any cruelty could. He made them live, every day, by the standard of the man they had once thrown away. Kingsley Aero was saved, but it would no longer run on lies. Coal Meridian oversaw every new KX-47 unit that came off the line. Technical staff were given the authority to stop the assembly line the moment they detected a risk, a power that would have gotten them fired a year earlier. Sterling and everyone tied to his scheme faced investigation. The company that had once punished honesty was now required to reward it, and the people who had worked in fear were finally allowed to do their jobs the right way. In the last light of the evening, Bennett walked out of the factory as the sunset spread across the test runway. His phone buzzed, and Nora's small voice asked whether he would be home for dinner. Bennett smiled and said, "I'm on my way." Behind him, an experimental aircraft lifted off the runway, safe and steady, carried by a balancing system he had designed with his own hands. Forbes had named him the richest man in aviation, but for Bennett the true victory was simpler and larger than any fortune. It was the certainty that no one ever again could look at his decency, his responsibility, and his quiet refusal to lie, and dare to call any of it useless.
Here, young friend. Be my guest inside.
Once you open, let's get it. All right. Welcome in, guys. I'll take that. The hell? Nice. Oh. Let me get this. Next boss coming up was tough as hell. Who is it? Gorillas are fire.
Well,
Took me no joke 2,000 tries.
I'd stake you're one
Really?
more monkey from Mount Huaguo.
Oh gosh. The White Clad Noble. Oh, that's the name of the boss.
My rank of birth.
Oh, we could upgrade here.
All ought to call me.
I love it. Use the gourd immediately. Increases poison resistance. That's cool.
Look. If something
Let's see. Store. Focus on audio cues, not visual. Got you. Oh, I need 2400. Damn. Oh, I'm so close to having it.
is your fancy.
Almost there.
Next time, down a few mouthfuls.
Fight a few more enemies, I'll be straight.
It's delightful.
Alright.